journalist. She also has a Bachelor's of Arts in Mass Communications and Spanish from Our Lady of the Lake University, wings up. Her session today is called Doing It All as a One-Woman Band. So without further ado, please welcome OLU alum, Angelica.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It really always does feel full circle whenever I have to participate in something that's OLU related. Because I was in all of your shoes just a couple of years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. So yeah, it always feels great to be back in some way, even if virtually. And actually, speaking of OLU, when I was there, I never thought that I would have this job. So I'm going to talk a bit through that and through the process that that it took for me to get to where I am today. But yeah, when I was at OLU, I didn't think that I would be a video journalist even, or at BBC News. I don't even think I knew what BBC News was at the time. But anyway, to get started, I do have a presentation that I can't share myself on the screen, but Alexis will share it for us. And so I just wanted to start with talking a bit about, not talking about me, I don't like talking about me, but just talking a little bit about my journey to get to where I am. So I am from San Antonio, Texas. I was born and raised here, and I got into journalism when I was in high school. Maybe some of you all started the same way, either through like the newspaper on campus or the yearbook on campus. So I was drawn to storytelling in high school for different reasons, but I got into journalism through writing mostly, through writing, newspaper articles. And that's how when I, ended up at Our Lady of the Lake University, I got involved with the Lakefront Student newspaper. So I, worked on the newspaper for the whole 4 years that I was at OLU. And then I became the editor-in-chief for the last 2 years that I was there during my junior and senior year. And so I have always loved people. I have always loved learning about people's stories and telling them, also finding creative ways to tell them. I think that storytelling is the best way for us to learn about each other and about the world. And so that's kind of why I do it. And so when I got to Our Lady of the Lake, I thought that I was going to be a print reporter somewhere, maybe working for a newspaper, for a magazine. And then I discovered video through one of my classes there, and here I am now, right? So I signed up for this job 4 years ago. I've been now a video journalist at the BBC for 4 years, and that happened after grad school. So at OLU, I realized I love video, and I kind of wanted to further my career in video specifically. I always regret that I waited to take my video classes until my last year at the lake because they were at night. And my 3 years there prior to that, I was like, oh, I'll just hold off. Like, do I really want to stay at a class from 7 to 9 p.m.? I think it was the time that it was hosted. So I kept waiting. And now I regret it because I fell in love with video and I wish I would have taken classes sooner. So therefore, when I went into grad school, I knew I wanted to go into grad school for different reasons. Mostly because at some point I would like to teach at the university level. And so I, knew I wanted to go to grad school. And then when I got in, I knew I wanted also to perfect my video skills, because since I got into video so late at OLU, I knew that there was so much still to learn. And so that's why I did video for 2 years at Berkeley, had a lot of internships, and landed this job at the BBC. And so in my next slide, I could tell you what I signed up for in the job. When I got hired on 4 years ago, things were a little bit different. It was President Donald Trump. He was beginning his presidency. There was a lot to cover, so many stories to do, so many stories to be told. So I thought I was going to be, producing, filming. I was going to be pitching stories that I would be sent to do them. I'd have a glamorous job, filming people and then coming back and editing them and, making them very creative. And, I was going to go into people's homes, have them tell me their whole lives, sometimes present on camera, and all of that I do. But I also, in this session, want to be more straightforward about what the job is, because I know a lot of you might be wondering like what path to take, or if you want to do video for TV, video for online. And so I kind of want to be straightforward about what the job is, because it's not as glamorous as it seems. It is very fun. I learn something new every day, but it's also a lot of hard work. And I do it, as the title of this session says, as a one-woman band. So I do it all by myself. For the most part. Sometimes I do get to work with other colleagues, and that for me is like the biggest blessing for different reasons. But for the most part, I'm usually by myself, carrying my equipment. So I'm a journalist that uses these two cameras as my tool to tell stories. And so I normally am carrying these two cameras plus my tripods, plus, a bunch of other stuff, my microphones, my lights for interviews. And like, it was said in my intro, I travel throughout the US telling stories. But it's always something always happens, That also means that I realize 15 minutes after starting an interview that the microphones have been turned off and I have to start all over again. Or, sometimes we say we wait so long for the right shot to film the right moment, and you waited so long, spent an hour or two like at the same spot, and it's going to be like 10 seconds in your video. So yeah, there's a lot of pros and cons to this job, and we'll talk a bit about all of them in a bit. Um, but yeah, that's that was what I signed up for, and of course, it's what I'm doing, and I love it so much. But it also has its cons. So I did want to show, because my job, a lot of times, not even my family members understand what I do. I think when you say that you're a video journalist, people assume that you're always on TV, that you're either in TV or that maybe you, I don't know, make videos for like companies or something. Like people don't really understand what the role of senior video journalist is the whole time. So I did want to show two, even if it's just the first like 30 seconds of two videos that I did. They're very different from each other, just to kind of show you the range of stuff that I do. So I can do one day explainer video, which is, you're taking a topic and trying to explain that to the US audience of the BBC. Or sometimes I also do feature videos, which are very personal. They're human stories about how people are affected by something. This last year, I've been working on a lot of stories about the pandemic and how that's affected people's lives. And those are more intimate stories. I go into people's homes and ask them about the things that they're having to deal with, their burdens. I think those are the favorite stories that I like to do, things where other audience members can connect to. And they're kind of like a hybrid between documentary, like short documentaries with video. So we can just show about 30 seconds, if that's okay, Alexis, of each, if they do play, just to kind of show the variety of stuff that I do as a video journalist. And only if they play. If we have trouble playing them, that's fine.
Sorry, I gotta share my screen. Give me a second.
Mm-hmm. And so for all of you who don't know, in the meantime, the BBC is the biggest broadcaster, the biggest news organization in the world. And it's based in the UK. It's a British Broadcast Corporation, but we have people all over the place, all over the world. And so I work out of the Washington, D.C. office, or at least I did for 3 years before the pandemic came. And we have, it's not the biggest team ever. We're not like CNN or NBC or all of these other American networks that have thousands of people working here in the States. We have a very humble team of 30 people covering all of the US for, again, the biggest broadcaster in the world. And yeah, and I was based in Washington, D.C. for 3 years, and then the pandemic brought me home. And now I'll be staying here in San Antonio, which is great because I love covering Texas. There's so many stories here. And so this first video that we're going to see is actually from here, from San Antonio, and it's about the pandemic's toll on a family.
It's one thing to say I'm coming to see one person, but to come and see two people, my father and my grandfather. Somehow we're still waiting at home for them to come back. We're expecting them to walk through the door, but being back here just reminds me that they're actually gone.
In the last 2 months, at least 4 members of the Munoz family tested positive for COVID-19.
Mi hija y yo nos recuperamos en casa, pero mi esposo pues tuvo que ir al hospital y ya no salió de ahí. Y mi papá también perdió la batalla con el coronavirus.
Both men died one day apart.
The coronavirus has disproportionately impacted Latinos. We represent 18% of the U.S. population now, yet we make up 34% of the coronavirus.
And so that's just a snippet of the video. And later on, we heard more from the family and how the death of their family members is affecting them, but then also how they're part of this statistic of Latino deaths to COVID in the US. And so, I always try to do stories about how big things affect people at the local level, whether that's here in San Antonio or anywhere else in the US. So in this case, I was taking a story like the coronavirus and how it's affecting the Latino community, which we all know there was one of the most affected disproportionately here in this country. But I was making it a little bit more personal and actually going to one of these families affected by it. And so that's the story that I filmed. I pitched it to my editors. I made contact with this family. I went to interview them, took all of my stuff, my equipment, set up the camera, interviewed them, filmed with them for 2 days actually. And then I came back, scripted, and put it all together. So that was the first video. And then if we could just show a part of the second one, only because it's so different. So the second one is actually an explainer.
The dog has 5.
Just to show kind of like the variety of videos that we do, because online video is so different from TV, but also so the same. Like we still care about, telling people information. We still care about having people's stories and people's lives in our coverage. But also we do things a little bit differently because we know that people that are scrolling online won't stay and watch something unless they're really interested. So we have these like catchy intros, or we just, the language that we use is a little bit more casual. And so you'll see this in this video.
Con la comunidad latina, parte de la comunidad americana, vamos a tener una victoria grande. El presidente es el presidente de todo el pueblo que está ahí.
Democrats dreaming of taking on President Trump have mostly woken up to the fact that in 2020, for the first time in history, Hispanics will outnumber eligible Black voters by more than 2 million. These voters have proven to be an essential part of the Democratic base. Y los candidatos a la presidencia lo saben. Bueno, la mayoría.
We are seeing more candidates build outreach tools to different communities, which include doing materials or ads in Spanish language.
And it's nothing new.
Queridos amigos, les habla la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy.
Jackie Kennedy famously spoke Spanish in a 1960s ad for her husband, John.
Ningún obstáculo es muy grande.
So did former President Obama.
Pero ¿cómo les está yendo a los candidatos presidenciales del 2020 con el español?
Senator Kamala Harris's website initially read that she had wasted her life.
All right, and so that was very different from the first video, because in this one we took something like the Latino vote and said, well, how can we examine how the candidates are doing in their outreach? And me being a Latina, I'm actually the only Latina working for the BBC in the United States. I was like, well, why don't we do something on kind of grading their Spanish or looking at their efforts to reach out to the Latino community through the use of language. And so we made that video, which was a little bit more fun. I was presenting, which I do sometimes, not as often as some people think, or like my family would love to think, but I do sometimes present on camera. And that was one of the stories where I was just kind of talking about, what they were doing ahead of the 2020 election. So that's just to show you kind of like the variety of stuff that I do. But I did want to kind of go back in time, because again, I want this to be as helpful as possible for you all who are trying to figure out like what it is you want to do. So I brought out from the archives my first ever video that I filmed. It was actually when I was at OLU. And I waited until my senior year to do video classes because they were at night, and I regret that so much. But this was the first video I ever did. I didn't know how to use the camera. I was in the classes to learn, and they were all great. I was learning how to piece things together, how to edit them. So yeah, always take advantage of your classes because they're going to teach you stuff that you're definitely going to use in the future. So this is one of the first videos that I did. We don't have to watch it all. It's actually kind of embarrassing to watch. I cringe every time I look at it, but it's, we all have to start somewhere. So maybe I could just send the link around and y'all can watch it after the fact, unless y'all want to watch a bit of it now.
We're trying to open it, but it says that the video is private.
Oh, okay. Maybe I did that again because I cringe every time that I think about it. Maybe I was like, let me hide it from people. Let me hide it from the world. But that was the first video I ever did at OLU. And so a lot of people ask me, why video? Because I made this pivot early on when my career was just starting. I I think I'm an excellent writer. I love to write still, but I really wanted to do something a little bit different and go to video for a lot of different reasons. And a lot of this I learned while at Our Lady of the Lake. Um, and I wanted to kind of go into that by asking this question. I know it might be hard for all of us to answer, so I can just speak personally about it. But, what is the oldest memory you have? It can be anything, right? In my case, the oldest memory I have is from this photo. I was a year and 3 months, and it was Christmas. And I still remember, I don't know scientifically how far back we can remember, as people, but I can still vividly remember in my mind that I was feeling very hot and flushed. And you can tell, I think, in my cheeks because I had had a fever the night before. As at least my mom says, right? I had had a fever. And I still remember, I think because maybe I was starting to walk then, or I had just barely started walking a couple of months earlier. I still remember like walking through my uncle's house and looking up at everybody. I think maybe it was like the first time that we were all together, or that I was in a space with all of my family, and that I could walk so I could look up. And so my perspective was changing. And I just remember, like the smells and talking to people. And I think that's like the oldest memory I have. And in reflecting on that, and why it is that I still remember that, I go back to everything being so visual. And so that's why I think video is so important. So people remember things like images. If you watch something on the local news channel about like a fire, or about, how big something is, or everybody can remember the images from the pileup that happened in Dallas a couple of months back before the snowstorm that hit here in San Antonio, right? Like there were so many cars on the road. Like those are images, and you can remember that in your mind because you're seeing something visually. Also, people can remember moments. And so moments is something that I take very seriously in my job and doing video, because I always try to be in places where something is happening. And I want to be able to capture that there was that interaction, or that those words were said between people. And I think that's something that you can't really do in text. Like you can write about something, but it's hard sometimes for people to imagine it if they're not there. And I've always thought, and it's true, right, that as a video journalist, you go where people can't. So I'm very fortunate that I get to travel a lot in my work. And I know, like, I take it as a big responsibility because I know that not everybody at home who watches work can also do the same to go see it themselves in person. So I always want to be there for moments, right? And to capture interactions, to capture things that happen that other people can't see them for themselves, at least from home. And also feelings. So people remember how something made them feel. I think that there's a quote about that that's always being shared that's very famous. You can forget, people or words or whatever, but you won't ever forget how someone made you feel. And I think that video makes you feel things that sometimes a text piece doesn't. And that's not to say that text isn't important, but it's just you connect to people because you can see their faces when they're telling you their stories. You can hear how they're like, maybe their words are kind of shaky because they're either very hurt, or you can hear the emotion whenever they're like yelling, or crying, or all of that you can show through video. And you can show that instead of saying, she cried as she told me this, like you actually see the person crying. And I think that because of these three reasons, now I can't imagine myself doing anything else but video, just because it's such a different way to tell a story. And also, so I think so, the word for it would be like there you make a connection with people. Again, if you're scrolling through Facebook and like start watching a video, something from that video had to grab your attention, right? Whether it's the images, or you're seeing an interaction, a moment where something is happening and you're like, oh, what is that? Or you start feeling something maybe because you see somebody crying, or you see, images of war, you see images of, whatever it might be. It's these three things that for me make video so important and make it, why I want to do video reporting for as long as I can. That might not be forever, and we'll get to that in a bit. But for as long as I can physically do it, I want to be doing video reporting in some way or another. So the obstacles and challenges, again, as I mentioned, I do travel a lot. For the most part, it's on my own, it's by myself. And so as a video journalist who does this, there's a lot of obstacles and challenges, and we can talk through each of them. But the number one is the physical demand of my job. So I showed you right now like the two cameras I carry, and this is probably the most important part of my kit, but also the smallest. I carry with me tripods. I carry with me, and I have it all here in a pile if y'all want me to show you. But it always sometimes more than 50 pounds. And then that's aside from my luggage where I have my clothes inside. I have the stuff that I need, like as a normal human being to function. So I carry that as well. It's also it can be very lonely. I always like being in a newsroom or being in collaborative spaces because you can talk through stories, you can brainstorm about what will work or what technique you can do in your video, whether it's a filming technique or in post-production. And sometimes you don't have that. And I've gone to places, one of my first stories that I did for the BBC was on Valentine's Day. And I remember being in California, being in my hotel room. I was there for a couple of days. And even that morning on Valentine's Day, one of my sources had said that actually they didn't want to be in the story anymore. And I was like, trying to like wrap my head around like, wow, like I came all the way over here and, to do this story. And now they've said no. And I was like, trying to kind of like talk them into it again, or at least like figure out why they said that so that I could explain that to my editors. I wasn't on a date with who is now my fiance. So I had a long distance relationship to begin with because I was already working away from San Antonio. But also I wasn't here for that like special day, as special as Valentine's Day is or isn't. Like I wasn't here. I had a bad day pretty much. And at the end of it, I still had to go to a restaurant and have dinner by myself, watch other people have dinner with others. So it can also be a very lonely job. That's not to say that I don't enjoy it, and also that, I'm not in the field every single day. Normally, the stories that I'm working on, I have to plan and pre-produce, so I can be, planning and doing stuff in the newsroom or in my mom's house, which is where I am now, for like 1 or 2 weeks, and then I go out to film. So it's not that I'm like out there every single day or, taking a flight every week. But in those instances, it can be pretty lonely. Um, Also, I think we heard a bit earlier from one of our other speakers that there's this burnout that exists from the news cycle. Things are so busy, especially for people that work on TV or even online. Like you have to crank out reports every day if something happens, during President Trump's time in office, there was something happening every single day. So I was getting really tired and I've only been in this job for 4 years now, but some days are just very difficult because they go so fast. You have to do the work in little time, and burnout is real. So these things exist in a news job, and I think it's also something that we have to talk about more before, even before we get into these jobs. Like at the college level, I don't think I ever really had anybody tell me throughout, undergrad or grad school, kind of these things, that at some point you might get tired of doing your job, but then you have to remember why you do it. And so now I kind of combat that by asking myself every morning, or especially every afternoon after I've had a busy day, I'm like, okay, what's my intention? What are my obstacles and how am I going to like overcome that? Because I really do love my job and there's always these moments of difficulty, but then of course, once you get over that, then you're back to telling stories. And that's at the end of the day, what's most important for me and for most journalists. The next thing on this list is, sorry, like I don't want to be going through this list of like negative things. I just want to be very upfront about the job. But there is sometimes a lack of work-life balance. And we also heard from the past presenter who, the pandemic has taken us all to work from home. And sometimes it's hard to differentiate between like the space where you work, which right now for me is like this dining room table, and then like the life that you live, which also is, at the dining room table. I eat here as well. So you have to kind of create divisions, especially right now during a pandemic where everything is happening in the same space. And so you have to try to figure out how to do it, whether it's, okay, I'm going to work during the day, and then the thing that will separate my workday from my like livelihood, maybe it's a run, or maybe I can go on a drive or something to kind of leave that workspace and then come back and live my life. And then the next thing is something that, again, no one ever told me, but discrimination for being a woman with a camera. I a lot of people that do this job are men. And the times where it's women, it's normally for a local news station that they're doing something on camera, and they normally have like a cameraman with them. Sometimes they are MMJs, which means that they're doing it all. They're carrying their tripod and their camera, and they're going live from a scene all by themselves. But those occasions are kind of rare, and so whenever I've had comments made to me, whether I can handle all of my equipment or whether I know how to use the camera. Sometimes I have to set up my equipment and I have to kind of tell the person that I'm going to interview, like, oh, like it'll take me 10 minutes, but then you'll be ready to go. And then they'll be like, oh, do you need any help? Or like, do you know how to work with it? And it's always kind of been, I don't think that's ever going to go away. I know I'm also young, and so maybe they're like, oh, does she know what she's doing? She looks like she's still in college. But at the same time, I think I combat that by always securing them or like letting them know, like I've been doing this for a while. I know how to use everything. It'll just take 10 minutes to get it all going. And also toll on mental health. So that goes into the next slide, because you're not always going to cover pretty things. You're not always going to like get to cover just fiesta or just an event that came into town or a concert. Sometimes it's really difficult things. And even when I think about, people ask me like, what's the most important story that you've covered? And I can't name just one, but I cover a lot of immigration stories. So I'm, at the border quite often. That's actually the trip that I came back from. I was at the Arizona border. So immigration stories are always some of like my favorite to cover, but also some of the ones that I have, it just takes me longer to process because I'm telling stories about people's lives and, the challenges that they've had to overcome, about, the terrible things that they've gone through to get to where they're at. So that can also take a toll on your mental health. And you're going to be covering these stories, because unfortunately there's always suffering happening in the world. And it can be hard, but also I always look back and think that those are some of like the favorite stories that I've covered, or at least some of the ones that I feel this personal connection to. And so, one of the biggest ones also that was recent was the El Paso shooting. Again, I mentioned that I'm the only Latina in the newsroom. And so whenever it comes to stories about the Latino community, I'm usually the one pitching them, the one like, raising my hand and asking to go to do these stories. But also when it's stuff like breaking news, stuff about immigration, I'm the only, native Spanish speaker. They asked me to go. And that's, a responsibility that I don't take lightly. I always want to, do the best to put these stories out and make sure that they're a good representation of the Latino community. And so when El Paso happened, and I actually didn't even know yet the reason why it had happened. I just knew that there was a shooting, and my editor called me, and it was on a Saturday. I remember I had just finished eating pizza with a friend in DC, and my editor called me and said, "Hey, there's this shooting that happened. We don't know the death toll yet, but because we already have seen this manifesto from the shooter, like we'd like you to go." And at the time I hadn't read the manifesto. I was like, oh, okay, like, yeah, I can do it. And I, said yes without, again, knowing like what the story was, at least at length at the time. And then he, went on and said, well, we'll want you to cover a lot of voices from Latinos since that was his target. And in that moment, I was like, whoa, like I didn't really know the story completely yet. And it kind of, came out of the blue that he said that. And it made me two things. It made me like very emotional in that moment when I was on the phone with him, and I was like, do I want to go? Like that sounds very traumatic, and I don't know if I as a journalist can cover it without getting emotional. But then also, like, who else, if not me, then who? So that's going back to, sometimes you're going to have these stories, and sometimes you're going to be the person who's best placed to do them because of who you are and because you're part of a community. So yeah, you're always going to be covering trauma, but the best thing, or at least the thing that I always remember, is that, if I'm not telling these stories, then who is? And so we can watch just a snippet of the video in the next slide of my, this is one of the moments. And again, going back to how video, like you can't really like see moments. You could easily read an article or something saying like, oh, at a vigil for, the people that died at the El Paso shooting, a group of mariachis sang Amor Eterno, which is like a big song in the Latino community. I think we all know Amor Eterno if we, grew up, especially in San Antonio. We hear it at funerals. We hear it sometimes even like at weddings. It's a very important song, I think, for our community. And so in the video, I don't know if we'll be able to play it.
Yeah, it's asking me I need to request access to it, so I'm guessing it's still private. So
Everything's private.
let me see. I just requested to the email, so let's see if it can.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. I think it went. Could you mind just requesting it again?
Yeah.
And so the only reason why I want to show this video is because it goes back to the idea that in video you capture moments. And it's one thing to explain to someone, what happened through a text piece, but then if you're actually showing them, if you were there on the ground and as a reporter, you can say, oh, well, I went to cover the shooting and I was there in moments of grief for this community. I just think it's, another level of powerful. And so I just want to show a little bit of this moment.
Tarde o temprano estaré contigo para seguir amando.
So that's just a little bit from that moment. And I still, I think even if I wouldn't have been there and filmed that myself, I would still feel something after watching it because you see the community that's there. You see the grief in their eyes. And yeah, I think that moment, if I wouldn't have been there to capture it in video, I think, maybe somebody wouldn't have healed the same way, somebody from the Latino community. That video did go viral on Twitter when I had first shared it. And I still remember reading comments in the threads about, people saying that they were in one way or another kind of starting to heal from having, felt like targeted in their country. So I think, as also was mentioned in the prior session, video is a form of therapy also, or it's a form of also helping community members when people watch. They'll either want to reach out or they'll want to take some kind of action. And in some cases that action is just starting a process of healing after some kind of traumatic event to the community. So we can go on to the next slide. So this job, again, there's some things that you don't really learn until you're actually doing it. So some of the things that I've learned throughout, doing journalism is that you always need to be a good listener. So I always, want to go into an interview and only pay attention to the people that I'm interviewing. I want to be there fully present. I want to ask good questions at the end of it. I want to ask good follow-up questions as well, depending on what they're saying. But I really want to listen to their stories because I'm, going to have to tell them to a bigger audience. But also, I think a reason why people sometimes trust journalists, and especially during this time where there's so much distrust of media, there's a lot of sometimes backlash against journalists. I remember being at a Trump rally and people not wanting to talk to me because the media or journalists are the enemy, right? According to the last administration that we had. So I think that the best way that I've found to combat it is always being a good listener, even if I don't have the camera in hand. Like I genuinely want to learn about people. And I think as journalists or people looking at careers in communications, I think that's true probably for the most of you. Like you want to know people's stories and how to tell them, whether even if you're in PR, you want to know maybe the brands you're representing or the people that you're representing to be able to then tell their story to the world, whether it's for marketing purposes or for storytelling purposes, for journalistic purposes. So I always try to be a good listener. Even if it's off camera, I just generally want to know people's stories. And I think that's, a skill that I think is, invaluable to all of us who are in careers that are in journalism. I think also staying curious. I also never try to go into an interview, in my mind already thinking that I know what they're going to tell me. I always want to learn. I always want to have questions. I always ask questions, even of my editors, like, oh, I just always have questions to ask because, again, it goes back to the genuine curiosity and wanting to be a good listener and really comprehend people's stories well. And also being confident in yourself. There are times that, again, I've failed, I'm at a scene and I, forget to turn the camera on and I think it's rolling. And then I end up not recording something or, that I take a photo that's overexposed or, that's not as good as it could have been. Like we're always going to have these moments no matter in what career, what fields we're in. But I always go back to thinking like that I have so much to offer aside from that. Like those are just moments and they're temporary and we'll get through them. You sometimes might get a B or a C instead of an A, but that was like a moment. And you'll have more opportunities to make an A in your classes. But I think you always have to never lose confidence in your skills because if you're already taking classes at the university level as you all are, then you already know something more than others don't. Also, I think what we learn in the process of, being in a career, not just in journalism, is that the more we learn, the less we know. But it also helps you realize that you actually know more than you thought that you did. So I think I just wanted to mention these skills because I think they're invaluable, at least to what I do, and at least to, I think, for also what you all want to do in communications. And then I just wanted to end with resources because a lot of the things that I've been able to achieve or even to get to where I am today, it has always been with a lot of help from my professors or from organizations. And so some of the things that have helped me to this day that I'm involved with, it's organizations, journalism ones, whether it's the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, which I'm involved in, the San Antonio Association of Hispanic Journalists, the Society of Professional Journalists, which I think also has a chapter here in San Antonio. I'm also part of a mentorship program for Latinas that are in journalism. So if anybody ever needs a mentor, I'm always happy to talk to students and to people starting out in their careers. And also, I think it's important to always keep learning. So I kind of have gotten a good rhythm of the work that I do. It doesn't take me as long anymore to put together a video, but I also always want to feel challenged. I never want to feel comfortable in my work or that I can do it very quickly and very easily, because then I'm not challenging myself or I'm, not trying to make my work better. So I'm always learning, whether it's on YouTube, sometimes I'll just look up a course on YouTube, how to film outside, when it's really bright out, or how to film in the rain, how to do these things that, again, maybe you don't learn in the classroom, but that, will help you in doing a better job and doing your work to its greatest potential. So I'm always learning. And also internships are very important. And I started, having my first internships when I was at Our Lady of the Lake. My first summer there, and I don't even think it was required, but my first summer after freshman year going into sophomore year, I interned at La Prensa de San Antonio, which had gone away for a couple of years, but I think now it's back. And I, was going there twice a week during the summer. And I still remember taking the bus to get there. I didn't know how to drive at the time. It was unpaid. I wasn't getting paid for doing it, but I was learning a lot. And I was learning a lot of things about how a newsroom is managed. I sometimes didn't have a lot for me to do, but I'm always an observer. So I was watching how the newsroom was functioning, who was doing what, who was talking to who was managing who. And so that really helped me even now understand how things work in a newsroom and going into the current job that I have. And also, I think you also want to talk to people at these internships, whether they're hands-on or not, because sometimes you're also at an internship where you're just an observer shadowing, but you always want to ask questions how do you do this? How do you do that? And I've seen from the last two sessions that we had that y'all are very good question askers. So you always want to do that to learn from others. And I always love also questions being asked to me. So if y'all have any questions after the session, I'd love to try and answer them. And yeah, I'm here to help. I hope that kind of covered what I do for a living. It's something again that I enjoy. I know that maybe I like talk too much about the challenges and the obstacles, but it is something that I love to do, and I can't imagine myself doing anything else. So if you all have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Angelica, I just want to thank you so much. I know, and I think, speak for all the students that your presentation was very inspiring, and coming from an alumni from OLU, it is inspiring, and everything that you do working for BBC and being a one-woman band. So I really appreciate you being here and, presenting your insight to our students. But like Angelica said, we are going to be taking questions right now. So if you have any questions, like I said in the beginning, you can either send them through Instagram, Commference, or you can send them through WebEx, the platform that we are on now. So we do have a couple questions on Instagram. So this question is from Sophia. She says, what misconceptions are there about the industry and how do you combat them?
There are a lot of misconceptions. Again, going back to even the last 4 years of people saying that they don't trust media. So there's, misconceptions around how we gather news. A lot of people think that reporters sometimes, sit at a desk and just make calls, or they don't. I think they forget sometimes that the people that are out reporting or talking to real humans, that it's not just information coming in for all of the networks to then distribute, that we're actually, putting in our effort to, we're making calls at the desk, but we're also going out to places and we're telling stories from the ground. Again, whether that's on camera or not. I also sometimes do radio stories where I just take out, I go with my recorder, my audio recorder, especially when it's sensitive stories and people don't want to be on camera, either for safety reasons or whatever it may be. But we're always trying to find ways to be on the ground and to be where the community is, telling stories about people. So I think people sometimes distrust us because they think that we're not there. I think also it has to do with media organizations, at least at the national level, only being based usually on the coast. So we have, CNN based in Atlanta, or we have, Telemundo and Univision based in Miami, but they're all very coastal. And I think a big misconception is that there's no one covering the rest of the US. I know in the 2016 election, it was a big issue for a lot of people saying that, the news didn't cover rural America. No one knows what's happening in the Midwest, or there was no reporters there. So I think a misconception is that we're not present there. We are. It's, maybe not in the big numbers that you want to see, but we are telling stories all over the place, especially a company like the BBC. We're all over the world. We have, I think, more than 5,000 people that work for our company. It's global, and we are on the ground trying to tell stories. I don't know if that answers your questions, but I think that's a big misconception that we're not there and that we're not present when big stories happen, but we are. I think you might be muted, Catalina.
Sorry, thank you. Laura, you had your virtual hand raised. If you want to ask your question, you can.
Okay, so I'm also double majoring in journalism and Spanish, and I know about the Munoz family. I know their youngest daughter, Mari. I saw when she posted that her parents both, her grandpa and her dad passed away within 24 hours. So that really hit home. It was really sad to hear. But one of the questions I had was, what has been some of the challenges you face as a Latina journalist?
Some of the advantages? Some of the challenges. Okay. Yeah, there are a lot of challenges. So when I walked into my newsroom 4 years ago, I was at the time, there weren't also that many people of color in the newsroom, but I was walking in as the only Latina. And I was arriving from California, where there's a lot of Latinos, and also from being from Texas, you're always surrounded by, somebody either speaking Spanish or just by Latinos generally. And so when I got to DC, it was very much the opposite. In my newsroom, I was the only one who natively speaks Spanish. To this day, I still am. And at times, I mean, some of the biggest challenges is not letting myself be taken to a story, or like sometimes I go to stories, especially in Latin America with the news crew, and my role for them is to be a translator. And I always try to like say, no, I'm also a producer, but I think the assumption that I can be a translator whenever they need one is a big challenge, because you always have to prove like, okay, yes, I know the language, but also I'm a reporter. I want to do the story just as much as you do. So I can come and help you with translation, but I also want to be reporting on the story myself. So that's a big challenge. Another one is, I think, trying to convince editors that something is a story, because I think in the Latino community, there's a lot of things that we know that, other communities don't know about. And sometimes, like, even mariachis, I had done a story at one point about like mariachis, and my editor was like, what are mariachis, and it's like trying to convince people that things that are part of the culture that I grew up in are stories. I think that's also a challenge. And I think also, I mean, more internally, I think people, it's hard to convince editors you want to do stories about your community or the community that you belong in. And that's not just for Latinos, right? And not just for our the Latino community, but generally, like I've, in my newsrooms, I've seen Black colleagues try to fight for a story, and the editors say like, oh, you only want to do it because, it's something that affects you, but does it even affect other people? So I think fighting to do stories that represent our community is the biggest thing. And I always overcome that by saying, well, then if we're going to do a story about, XYZ, then who are you going to send if not somebody that knows the community? I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah. And then the other question is why did you decide to pursue a master's degree? That's something I want to do also.
I'm kind of the person, and I don't know if it's just the way that I grew up, like I always want to do the best work that I can do. And I knew that if I pursued an extra degree and I kept learning, that it was going to help me be a better journalist and also a better employee for whoever was going to hire me later on. I also knew early on that I wanted to work at the national level. And unfortunately, because of how, organizations are set up, normally they're looking for people who have master's degree, or at least that's what I've found. And I think it's very unfortunate. I don't think it should be that way, but I think also I had to play into, thinking in advance, okay, if I eventually want this job, then I want to be as educated as I can. And also as I mentioned, I was getting into the video world a little bit late in my undergrad career. So I knew that I wanted to perfect that, or at least to work on becoming a better video journalist. And so that's why I was like, either I'm going to start at the local level and then work my way to national, or I can go to journalism school, do these extra 2 years to get a master's, and then kind of already be ahead of the game a little bit, and then apply to national jobs, which is what I did. And that's how I ended up getting the job that I did. But also, I'm a big advocate for grad school generally, because it gave me a lot of opportunities that I didn't have at the undergrad level for many reasons. I learned a lot, don't get me wrong, I learned a lot at OLU, but also, for example, at grad school, I was going on trips. I had never planned a reporting trip for, before in my life. And I was getting travel grants to go and report from, that's how I did my thesis projects. I was doing stories on the border. I did an election story in Arizona about Latino voters. And all of that was funded, by grad school. And I wouldn't have done that otherwise at the undergrad level. And I think having that experience kind of, first of all, opened my eyes to the world. And I was like, oh, wow, I can do stories that aren't just local, but I can, go somewhere else and do a story. And I really liked that. Like, I think I kind of got addicted actually to traveling for stories and to meeting new people, to learning about people. And so I knew that I wanted to do that at the national level. And, through grad school, I was able to have that experience kind of earlier on instead of waiting to get that job or to get that internship to learn how to do that. And just more generally, like I always want to be a chingona, right? Excuse the language, but I always like, I want to be as educated as I can. And I don't think that, those spots should only be for people that come from money or that, are affluent. And, I come from a very humble home. I'm in the home right now that I grew up in. I went to school at OLU and at Berkeley through scholarships. My mom is a single mother of twins, and I knew that she wasn't going to be able to send us both to college at the same time. So I, applied myself very well through high school to get scholarships. And even when I was at undergrad, I always wanted to have good grades and to do the best in all of my projects because, at some point I want to be maybe a boss or an editor somewhere. And so I kind of have always had that in my vision. And so I just thought that it made sense to go to grad school at the time. And it was probably the best decision I've ever made. It was also the first time I was leaving home, like to go do something outside of San Antonio. So it opened my eyes to a lot. Sorry, I'm going to mute it while the phone rings and while we get another question.
Well, thank you. And I woman band because that's what I had to do this semester for our TV production class, and it's not easy.
Thank you, Angelica. Danielle, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Tat. Hi, Angelica. My name is Danielle, and I'm also a multimedia journalist focus student. I'm about to graduate in 2 weeks, and what resonated with me was the part where you talked about the pros and cons of the job. You said it was, pretty sad to hear that it's not all glamorous, but it was very real to me, and I really want to know what I want to get myself into. So, how do you keep a healthy work life and, life in general? How do you keep that balance?
Okay, sorry. I had muted myself and couldn't unmute it. So it's difficult. I still ask myself that every day, and I ask myself if that's possible because I'm also at a point in my life now where I'm like, okay, eventually I'm gonna want to have children. Eventually, I'm gonna want to kind of like put my roots down somewhere, and maybe at that point, traveling won't always make sense. I can't always be on the road. At some point will want something that's a little bit more stable and comfortable. And I know that's in the future, so I'm not too worried about that now. But even on the daily, like I work right now because of the pandemic, we've moved our hours. So we all work 10-hour days for 4 days a week instead of 5 days a week for 8 hours. And it's both a good and bad situation because obviously you're working longer days, but then you have an extra day and you have a 3-day weekend. And so the BBC did that also kind of to understand that we're also living our lives. And of course, one of the biggest things that has helped with my work-life balance is being back home. Because I think if I would have stayed in Washington, D.C., away from my family and from friends that I have back here in Texas, I probably would have been always in my apartment alone, maybe looking for ways after work to like go, I don't know, to an exercise class if possible. But because of, the pandemic restrictions at the beginning, that would have been impossible. And I knew that I would have suffered a lot in the work-life balance part if I would have stayed behind in DC. And now that I'm here, though, I do find things, again, like, for example, even if it's just dividing, your workday with the rest of your life. So I try to like go on a run after my workday just to kind of like mentally take a break. And also I know, like I look forward to the run because I know that when I come back from it, I'm going to be like enjoying my afternoon instead of like still working. So I kind of try to find a division or something that's going to separate my workday from my actual life. But I guess the biggest thing that makes it a little bit hard for me at least is that I do really, I had put this quote on the trauma slide about how we carry the burdens of the stories that we tell. And that to me kind of makes the work-life balance a little bit tough because I'm someone that like fully throws myself into a story. Like I want to be there in a moment where a family is healing or, where people are going through stuff. And that takes time to process after the fact. Like, I know I'm not a victim. I'm just there to tell a story. It didn't actually happen to me, but I'm witnessing it. And that's very hard to witness something. And sometimes you're there for moments that don't even make the story, right? Because sometimes people are like, oh, can you please stop recording? Like, because they're emotional or they're crying. And so we stop recording, and I'm still present in this moment where someone's breaking down. And so it's very hard after the fact to then process that. But what's helped me is to just talk about it. Like I like to talk about the stories that I cover and the stories that I do. And I think that's kind of been like the biggest blessing, that I have people in my life, especially like other journalist friends, who want to know what I'm up to. And they're like, tell me about your recent trip or whatever. And I think that talking about it has really helped, because it kind of helps me understand that, work isn't all there is to my life. Like, I'm telling these stories that I love and that are important. But then also I kind of just remember by talking about it that, oh, like that's actually not my story though. Like I actually can then turn off my laptop, turn off my camera, and then go live my own life. So it's been things like that that have helped me. I don't know if that answered your question, but
It did. Thank
it's
you.
like that.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Danielle, for your question. Angelica, we have time for 2 more questions. One of them being, what keeps you going, your motivation, and do you have a set goal in mind?
I think the biggest motivation for me is the people that I meet, the people whose stories I am able to tell. Because for me, I take seriously like kind of having a relationship with my sources. And so even after I've done a story, I'm texting them, both for journalistic purposes to figure out like where they are now in their story or in their life, but also just because I genuinely then care about them and what they're going through. So for example, I just did a story that went out last month about fertility fraud. And so it's about a family that in the 1980s, the husband and the wife went to go seek help with fertility treatments because they couldn't have children. So they had artificial insemination, and they had 2 children through artificial insemination. And now, 38 years later, because of at-home DNA tests like Ancestry DNA or, 23andMe, they've found out that actually the sperm that was used in the artificial insemination came from the doctor himself. And so that kind of like turned their whole world upside down. Of course, like the 2 daughters who were conceived this way have had an identity crisis. And so like that story was intense for me to cover. And the part that motivated me to, though, is that I had this relationship with the sources. I've been texting them about how their lawsuit against the doctor is going. The story already went out, but I genuinely care about like their healing process and everything. So I think because I'm able to tell these stories and that I actually have a relationship with my sources and that I can keep talking to them about their stories even after, my actual story has gone out, I think that really motivates me. And again, going back to, at the BBC, I do get to tell some stories that my colleagues don't, again, because of who I am. And so I always think, if not me, then who? And then about the goal, I have so many goals. Um, I guess, more in like the near future, I would like to spend some time at one of our different bureaus. I'm lucky to work at the BBC and we're global, so we have bureaus all over the place. And I think it's a dream of mine to like spend, even if it's 6 months, like have a 6-month attachment in our Mexico office. My family's from Mexico, and we never really traveled there when we were children until I actually started reporting. I feel like I've gone to Mexico more times through my stories than with my family. And so I want to keep connecting with like who I am. So I would love to spend some time, working from our Mexico office. At some point, I would love to teach at the college level. And I would also, I mean, for me, I really like kind of executive producing or, helping people with their stories, like not just working on mine, but also helping mold people's stories. So at some point, I would like some kind of leadership position. Um, yeah, so different goals for different times in my life. But in the meantime, I want to keep meeting my deadlines, I want to keep doing good work and like not getting my bosses upset with me.
Cool. Well, Angelica, thank you so much. It's I can't believe it. I mean, time flies when obviously talking about interesting stories and having an OLU alumni speak to OLU students is such a big blessing. I really hope it's very hard as a student to really see your life after college. But I know that hearing it from you would, kind of put things into perspective. So that's it for this session. But I do have one question. I normally like to ask one question. I am the Lakefront newspaper advisor. And my question to you is, what can they gain from being part of that organization? And what was your favorite, part of being in that organization?
I think the Lakefront was probably the best part of me being in college. First of all, because I was putting the skills that I was learning in the classroom to practice. Not only was I having a reporting class where I was being told, the steps in interviewing someone, or, being learning about the questions that I should ask in an interview, but then I was actually being able to do that. And that to me was the biggest blessing, to put, the stuff that I was learning in the classroom to practice. I really think that without the Lakefront, I probably wouldn't have ended up in grad school even. That's where I published my first clips. That's where I also connected with a lot of students when I was distributing the newspaper. I would go out and myself during lunchtime, go down to the cafeteria and pass them out, and people were asking me about it, or they'd be like, oh, you know what, you should do a story on this. So it was also a good way to find stories. I just really think that that was a blessing for me, and my favorite part, I think, was especially being the editor-in-chief and kind of workshopping through stories with students. I think that was my favorite, because I would help them, not just help myself in my own reporting, but then also take someone's story and help make it better, but work with them on it. So not just make corrections and be like, do this, but actually sit down with other students who are my classmates, right? Who I was then seeing at the class later on, and work with them through a story. And I just love that. And I think that's what actually makes me or at that moment is when I realized I want to be a professor later on, or to teach journalism. I think being part of the Lakefront. And so I think everybody that's on here should join at least for 1 or 2 semesters, just to actually put into practice the stuff that you're learning in the classroom. And also, I think it made me be a little bit more braver, going back to my advice about being confident in yourself. Because it was putting me into situations where I had to talk to people that I would only see in the hallways, but I was interviewing them, right, about their lives, and they were telling me stuff that they wouldn't have told me otherwise, because we weren't friends before then, but then we were friends after, just for different reasons. I think it was the biggest blessing.
Yeah, I know. Thank you so much for that. I advise in the Lakefront newspaper. It's not just journalism. It's multimedia journalism. It's working on the website. It's working on social media. It's working on PR, a little bit of marketing. I mean, there's so much to it. So thank you so much for that. That was a very informative session. It's awesome to see an Olu alum going out there and changing the world with their storytelling. So that's it for this session. Once again, I am going to put the forms out here to go ahead and fill. I believe that's for some of your classes. But join us again tomorrow at 9:30. We'll start letting students in around 9:25. Angelica, if you don't mind staying behind for a few minutes just to chat. But thank you again, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this. This is officially the concluding day 2. For those that want to stay behind and have some chat with Angelica, Danielle, Laura, Mel, I don't know if you guys want to stay behind. You're more than welcome. I'll unmute you. That way you can have some more personal time. If Angelica has time, not sure if she has some time. Okay, perfect. But thank you guys for joining. We'll see you tomorrow at 9:30, and have a great, wonderful day.
Angelica, that was amazing.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Winstead.
That's how I learned about you, through Professor Winstead. So I'm so happy that I was able to connect with you, and that you were able to share such inspiring words with our students. I know that it really resonated with a lot of them. So we so appreciate you. Hopefully in the future, you can come down in person.
Yeah, because I live here now, which is so great. And so I'm only actually 15 minutes from the school. When I was there at Olu, I didn't know how to drive yet, probably because I was also a big nerd and I never made time to drive. And I would take the bus every day, and it's still one of the routes that I remember very clearly, everything that I would pass on my way there, because it was part of the 4 years of me being at Olu. But yeah, I loved that experience so much, and I'm very grateful for Olu. I'll always be grateful. I didn't even know what a master's degree was if not for professors that I had at Olu. My mom, she's an immigrant, and she only stopped at high school education, so she's not college educated. And all of these conversations were always so difficult to have with her, because she didn't understand. She was like, oh, but do you have to go to school? Or oh, can you just find a job, And so even navigating that world with the professors that I had at Olu made all of the difference. Yeah.
It's so good to see you, Angelica. And I've been keeping up with you on BBC. Love your stories. And congratulations on everything that you're doing, and on your fiancé.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. But it's really good to see you, and thank you for what you told the students today, and in reinforcing the realities of the job. I think sometimes that there's this gloss over, that people think that it's all the glamour and spotlight and not the hard work, which they do learn in our classes, especially Amanda. So They do learn about that hard work, but sometimes it doesn't resonate till they actually see someone like you and what you're doing. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Yeah, of course. Always happy to.
And Danielle Ojeda, she's actually online. I think her mic's off mute, so she'll be saying something. But she's a current editor in chief, and she just announced next year's editor in chief. So, want you guys to connect.
Yeah, it was a completely different experience than, the next one or the one before me due to obvious reasons, but I enjoyed my time, my year, it flew by, and like I said, I'll be graduating and going into the multimedia journalism field. So this presentation and your words really just will stick with me. I appreciate your advice, and I wrote down the mentorship program that you said you're a part of. I would